Quite a long time ago now, David, Geoffrey Elton tried to persuade people that there had been such a thing as a revolution in Tudor government. It was a claim about the nature of English administration and the history of English government and politics and its subsequent influence in the course of British history. But your dissent from this view came quite early on, didn't it?
Yes, I mean, it comes really at the beginning, before I even started work with him. I'd been a member of his special subject seminar. I performed well at one memorable moment when I was able to persuade him that he had actually classified a document wrongly. I became quite good at this. I can't remember if there was a circular letter to sheriffs that was in fact a proclamation, or a proclamation that was a circular letter to sheriffs. I can't remember. But Geoffrey's utter look of shock. And I said, please, Professor Elton, I think you're wrong. And I suppose that became the kind of motto of my relationship with Geoffrey. Please, Professor Elton, I think you may be wrong. After that, I encountered him. I got my major state studentship. I was going to work under him. There was no real choice, remember. There were the two dominant figures in the Cambridge history faculty. There was Jack Plum, who was already absolutely infatuated with Simon Sharma. And there was, we may discuss that later.
Oh, I do
And by the way, there was a terrible game that we all played at this point, which was finding the right title for the autobiographies of our great teachers. Geoffrey Elton's was History and Hard Work, and Jack Plum's was Power and Impotence. Anyway.
And going to parties with Princess Margaret.
And going to parties. I'm not sure whether that displayed the power or the impotence, but there we are. As always, a nice combination of the two. Anyway, but I'm going to do research under Geoffrey. And here again, I want to say something. I'm going to say lots of things, indeed have said some, which are not very favourable and not very nice about Geoffrey. Let's put one thing absolutely firmly on this nice table. Geoffrey treated his research students with a degree of respect, of friendship, of hospitality that I think was unique in Cambridge, and gave them a degree, and probably in Britain. And remember, the PhD is just being invented at this point. And he was heroic. And again, I'm sure the influence of the German seminars or whatever.
He was very much in the German professorial tradition.
Well, he wasn't. He'd reacted against it at this point. He was trying to make himself a Daily Express Englishman. I mean, the encounter took place that I'm describing now. It took place in his home. I never met him before. I was in Pretoria Road. At this point, it was a little tiny house in Pretoria Road. He was about to move into the grandeur of the great donnery of 30 Millington Road, paid for by the Tudor Revolutionary government and Tudor England and all the rest of it. But the great word was, don't tell people in the pub when we're going there. They don't know I'm going to. In other words, he was presenting himself as a petty bourgeois. In fact, he was an academic superstar. Anyway, we settle down. We go to the pub. What are you going to have to drink? Double gin and tonic, please. Face fell. Vast pint came out. Anyway, he then settled down, and his face fell even further because he said to me, "Well, you're a bright boy, bright lad. I know what I've got for you. You're going to work on the Exchequer, aren't you?" No, Professor Elton. What I would like to do is work on the court. The court. I've shown the courts no significance. Sorry, Professor Elton. I don't believe you. I'd actually done as my second undergraduate essay, because again, I had an extraordinary experience going up to Cambridge. I was at Fitzwilliam, which then was barely a college, and one could argue is scarcely a college even now. But I was supervised by this dreadful woman, Helen Clover, next door at New Hall, which I think has been bribed into recalling itself Murray Edwards. Anyway, she was an expert on minor saints of the Middle Ages.
Yes.
But in those days, you had to teach simply to keep yourself going. You were paid so little. She wasn't a university lecturer. She was just a college fellow. So she was teaching Tudor history. At the end of the first class, she said to me, Can you imagine? To a jumped-up 19-year-old, you know more about this than I do, which is absolutely true. And what I did, that she did one good thing to me. And once, that was why I didn't get a first in Parliament. Can you imagine the degree of inflation of head that leads to? But what she did was to say, right, do something different. So my first essay was on Lady Margaret Beaufort, and it was dreadful.
Yeah.
In retrospect, compared with most of the stuff that people turned out, it was rather good. My second essay on Anne Boleyn, I used one of the great 19th century works on her, and using that, I essentially worked out everything that over the subsequent 20 or 30 years I discovered about the nature of the Privy Chamber, about the inner royal household, about its political significance, all of that sort of stuff. So in other words, let's go back and now fit in why I'd done that. The Tudor Revolution, what the Tudor Revolution in government does, it's a kind, we're talking about is Germanness. It's a kind of applied Weberianism.
Yeah.
That's to say,
managerialism.
Not quite. Sort of. Weber remembers ideal types of government.
Yeah.
There is charismatic government, which is the government by an anointed monarch, or indeed it could be a modern dictator. And then there is bureaucracy, which is indeed managerialism, or as it were, essentially rational. Charismatic, of course, depends on emotion. Bureaucratic is rational. Elton had picked this idea up, though of course he despised sociology, and he argued that the revolution of government that he discerned, carried out by Thomas Cromwell, did two things. It effectively removed the king from the centre of government, in other words, replacing charismatic monarchical with the rule of experts like Cromwell, and it created the institutions that underpinned that expert rule, like the council, like the secretaryship of state, all of that.
So it heralds the arrival of the modern professional bureaucrat.
Yes.
That was its
That's
appeal.
its core. Now, I already realised, well, first of all, anybody with a brain would have realised the thought that you diminish the power of the monarchy under Henry VIII was simply demented. This is the moment. Isn't it simple, as I pointed out? The moment at which Cromwell says to Henry, kind of, mate, shove over. We've got some decent professionals here. We don't need amateurs like you, is clearly the moment. I reckon it's 2 days before he's executed by a deliberately inexperienced executioner. So the idea was always silly. And I think what we ought to do again, but let's get some of the bigger things through. We will then explain why this obviously silly idea had such enormous success.
Well, yes, I think that's very interesting.
And is going to be a very, very interesting point. But let's just explore it all a bit more. So I got a sense that politically what he'd said was simply wrong, right? And then I did my... I managed to sit there and Geoffrey's staring me down, you will work, which was highly complimentary, because the Exchequer and the fate of the Exchequer lay at the centre of Geoffrey's argument. So he obviously thought I was capable of doing it. But I said, no, I want to work on the court. So what he said to me was really interesting. You've got a fortnight to prove it's worthwhile. And I was so lucky that I'd done that first essay. And all I could do effectively was to go straight back to it. And I wrote a paper which effectively reworked that first essay and demonstrated that the fall of Anne Boleyn involved an intense structure of faction politics, not simply within the council, not simply with Cromwell, but actually within the Privy Chamber, because all the men who were executed with her belonged to the inmost department of the royal household. Fine.
So it's the power of personality.
It's a power of personality and so on. So all of that I understood. I then went and I researched that, as one does, over the next 3 years. And I did intense work on their artistic patronage, the patterns of political and religious affiliation and all the rest of it. What I didn't do, and this is really interesting, I didn't look at the key claims of Geoffrey that in this period, there was this sudden retreat, not simply of the king, but of the instruments of the royal household from the so-called government of the state. I didn't look at that at all. I didn't look at the court in an institutional way at all. I, of course, had a basic understanding of it. And here again, it's very important that people grasp this. If you want to describe power in Washington, what do? You talk about the White House, and you talk about the West Wing, and you talk about the Oval Office. You talk about places.
It's really the architecture.
It's
of power,
the architecture. And I had a very remarkable encounter. I've described my encounter with Geoffrey Elton. When after I'd left Cambridge and I went up to London, I encountered this very remarkable man, Hugh Murray Bailey, who had done work on the distribution of power within royal palaces and shown how the actual architecture conditioned the power structure of the court and also the overall nature of monarchy. He'd set out to show that not all royal palaces were like Versailles. And he demonstrated, very interestingly, Versailles and the English court, that's to say, let's say Versailles and Hampton Court, are arranged on two different principles. Versailles is arranged according to time. Rooms are public and private, depending on the time of day. We all know the business of the lever and the coucher. The moment the king goes to bed, the court retreats from the bedchamber. With each bit of clothing that comes off, one set of courtiers comes out, and leaving only the very most favourite, and indeed the mistresses, when he's undressed and tucked up into bed. In the morning, with the lever, again, in reverse order, they all come in. The difference in England is that the bedchamber is absolutely private. The architecture is determined by place, not by time. And the English court divides itself then according to place. In the Middle Ages, there are two main divisions which correspond to the two great offices that rule the court, the Lord Steward and the Lord Chamberlain. The Lord Chamberlain deals with the king's private quarters, the chamber, and the Lord Steward deals with the hall, where the servants are, and the whole of the commissariat. Now, why do we worry about? Remember, the royal court is by far the largest organisation in the country. It's as big as any provincial city and vastly richer. So in the medieval court, you've got these two divisions. You've got downstairs and upstairs. Downstairs is the world of service. Upstairs is the world of the chamber and of politics and whatever. But of course, all the institutions of our government, going back to the Norman period, stem from this household. So originally, the Chancellor is the King's chaplain, but he's also his clerk. Originally, again, the officers we talked about, the Exchequer, are his chamberlains because you keep money under the bed in a chest. But of course, the king is travelling round. Remember, England, for the whole of the Middle Ages, isn't a kingdom, it's an empire. And the kings are moving around over this vast Western European empire, but they need somewhere for government to settle down. So government, because clearly, if you want to pay some money into the king, you can't be trotting off to see him in Poitiers. So you develop...
And somebody's got to be in charge of the seal.
And somebody's got to be in charge of the seal. And so the Chancellor and the Chamberlains and the Treasurer of the Exchequer settle down in what is the only real palace, which is Westminster, next door to the Abbey, right? But of course, the king still needs somebody, because he's travelling around all over the place, to handle his private money and to handle his signatures on the sealing of documents and to give him advice. What does he do? Well, another officer appears from within the royal household who attends the king. So you get the Privy Seal communicating with the Chancellor, the Privy Seal, say, in Poitiers or Edinburgh or wherever the king is, communicating with the Chancellor in London. And then, because bureaucrats don't really like being inconvenienced very much, the Privy Seal quickly settles down in Westminster too, and you develop another officer, the Royal Secretary, who then travels around with the king and communicates with the Privy Seal and and the Chancellor in London, and exactly the same structure with financial administration and so on. In other words, this is what the Middle Ages called going out of court. All the institutions of government, and we are surrounded by them here, we're on the fringe of Westminster, begin in the royal household and then settle down in Westminster. And what Geoffrey argued was that this process comes to a halt in the reign of Henry VIII. In other words, this process of government arising from the king stops, and instead there's a permanent freeze, and new bureaucratic institutions separate from the royal court develop themselves. Is that clear?
Almost, except that 1485 and Henry VII. Now, I think that one of the problems about Tudor historians, and especially perhaps Geoffrey, is that they overemphasized the gap between what they called late medieval kingship and this supposedly new thing, early Tudor kingship.
Oh no! I think you're simply wrong.
I think Henry VIII was quite useful from Geoffrey's point of view in emphasizing that kind of difference. That there was substantial continuity between.
Of course,
these.
yes. So,
surely that's
if you'd let the expert get in, Geoffrey, on the other hand, completely accepted that. Geoffrey, the traditional line of divide had been 1485, the alleged beginning of modernity. Geoffrey rejected that completely, and instead he shifts it to 1529, 1533, the accession of Cromwell to power. And he focuses on that idea. Right. Let's now just go back to what I did and what he did. So I found myself having to write up my brilliant dissertation, because it was, on the structures of power, on patronage, their literary role, their involvement in the first edition of Chaucer, and all this sort of stuff. And I thought, well, I really better had look at the administrative history. But I thought, well, Geoffrey's done it all. I looked at it. It fell to pieces in my hand. And I failed to finish my dissertation. And I was rescued simply by the fact I'd been rude about Fitzwilliam. Let me now do the reverse. They gave me a research fellowship, which saved my career. I then spent 2 years working furiously, actually, not on all the things I've been looking at, the politics, the culture, the architecture, the dress and whatever, but actually on the institutional structure of the court. And what became clear was Geoffrey had got it completely and absolutely wrong, and about as wrong as you can possibly get it. What I was able to show was that if you looked at where the business of government was going on, exactly the same process of going out of court had happened under the early Tudors as had happened throughout the Middle Ages. What had happened was, again, under Henry VII, interestingly enough, a crucial division had happened. Instead of just the chamber and the household and the hall, you'd actually got a new private division. Again, there's this very big change in the later Middle Ages, in which the big general purpose rooms of the Middle Ages give way to much small. There's a notion of privacy, if you like. And the king had developed a new private apartment called the Privy Chamber. I think much of it is to do with all the threats against Henry VII. Remember, because he is himself a usurper, he's confronted perpetually by usurpation, and the threats even go to the heart of his household. There's one extraordinary episode in which the treason reaches to his Lord Steward and his Lord Chamberlain. So, there's a sense of profound threat. And so he retreats further and further and further, and you set up this new third department of the royal household, the Privy Chamber, those that directly surround the king, the inner staff of Downing Street, the West Wing of the White House. And what I was then able to do was to show that these people were not simply intimates. They weren't simply close body servants, and how close body servants is very exciting, because you'd had the Lord Chamberlain as the head of the chamber, the Lord Steward as the head of the household below stairs. The head of the Privy Chamber was called the Groom of the Stool, and he is responsible for wiping the royal bottom. It's quite an extraordinary story. The Victorians, of course, still roughly had the office, but couldn't possibly admit what it was. So it's reinvented as the Groom of the Stole, and you even invent a bit of coronation regalia for him to cart around. It's complete nonsense story. But he actually is responsible for wiping the royal bottom. So it's this intensity of personal service with all the power that goes with that. But he does something else as well. He controls, as I discovered, everything that Geoffrey said had gone away. He controls a new royal slush fund, two of them, in fact, the privy coffers and the privy purse. One is a kind of current account, and the other is a sort of deposit account, where you put, for example, in the 1530s, the privy coffers, the bulk of the yield of the vast quantities of both taxation and money confiscated from the monasteries goes straight out of the exchequer, straight out of augmentations, into chests. Literally, it's so primitive. Chests of gold which are kept behind the king's bedchamber. There's a private treasury. The Groom of the Stool also controls much more than the secretary the application of the king's signature. So astonishing. That was what I discovered in my dissertation. Now you can imagine that fundamentally undercut the entire argument.
Bit of a problem for Geoffrey.
A bit of a problem. What we did, we had a kind of truce. It's really interesting. He recognized it was a very good piece of work. In his second textbook, I think it's called Reform and Reformation, he tries to accommodate it. You can see it's very uncomfortable. I deliberately, in my dissertation, pulled back. I had then this we're going to tell you a lot in this. I then had this extraordinary encounter with one of my examiners. I was examined by Margaret Bowker and Jack Scarisbrick. Scarisbrick was completely useless. I've never encountered a worse examiner. And
massively distinguished biographer.
Well, I mean, not in this kind of area.
Professor of history at Warwick.
Not in this.
Much loved historian.
His comments were fatuous. He completely misunderstood the role of the French pension. We've had far too much detail, so we won't go into it. And his only substantial comments was to regret the fact that I hadn't put sufficient full stops after abbreviations, and I exaggerate not. Margaret Bowker was Geoffrey's great opponent within the faculty at Cambridge, a serious medievalist, and all the criticisms of this idea of some gigantic change in the 1530s came from medievalists, right?
Didn't she do a lot of work on Lincoln?
She was at the Diocese of Lincoln. She was essentially an ecclesiastical historian and a passionate Catholic. And there's a famous moment on television where she is dying of cancer and embraces the cross, and God took one look at her and made her live forever. But she was a brilliant examiner, and she invited me to drinks afterwards and offered me a deal. She said, "You've lied, haven't you, about my conclusion?" I said, "Yes." She said, "If you go explicit in how far you've undercut Elton, I am in touch with Joel Hurstfield in London, the Astor professor. He will back you for any job, and we'll get Elton." Do you know what I said? I am loyal to Geoffrey. I won't do that. And I then went and told Geoffrey. What a fool I was. That was the nature of our relationship at that point. I then went on and I developed these ideas, and I particularly started to look at what he'd regarded as being the two key things, the office of secretary and the council. And the result was I was able to show something very striking. Geoffrey had seen the Privy Council and the Secretary as the core of this new bureaucracy, he thought, completely separate from the king and all the rest of it. I was able to show that the Secretary, not so much Cromwell, because he was really a First Minister, but when the office is revived after Cromwell's fall, with people like Sadler and Wriothesley, where does the Secretary actually live? Well, he lives next door to the king. His rooms are directly next to the king's, for the very good reason that he's actually the king's secretary. And there's a most wonderful moment when Paget becomes the king's secretary, and he writes to the groom of the stool, the head of the Privy Chamber, who controls lodging in this area of the court, and says, "I'm terribly sorry, my rooms are completely inadequate." Yes, there sort of is a reply. Everybody says that. And then he says, "Well, I do need room for a table." This is a secretary without a table, a bureaucrat without a bureau. And then he says, "Well, I can't really put them in the room that I'm using at the moment because it's next to the king's bedchamber. And every time my clerks come in, they disturb the king, who's sleeping on the other side of the wall." Now, that is not remoteness. Do you understand what I mean? I'm then able to show again, because by this point I know much more, that the Privy Council actually meets directly next again to the king's bedroom within this inner structure of very elaborate private lodgings, because the Privy Chamber has grown by this point. In other words, far from these centerpieces of the Tudor Revolution being, as it were, physically separate from the king, they're in the heart of the court. So everything fell to pieces. And at this point, I'm afraid, I'd gone public on this. I wrote what was rather wittily described by my friend Kevin Sharp as my self-edited festschrift called The English Court. We'd also done a volume which was called Revolution Reassessed, with my former undergraduate student, Chris Coleman, and another student. He was another research student of Geoffrey Elton's, in which we'd raised all kinds of big questions about the Tudor Revolution. So relations become more and more hostile at that point, I'm afraid, and really, very sadly, break down in direct confrontation when Geoffrey did
easily confused.
Not at all. Geoffrey was the emanation of Thomas Cromwell. Again, there's a wonderful photograph of Geoffrey when he was a soldier in the Second World War. He finishes up as Sergeant Interrogator.
As a Grand Inquisitor.
He had done, I am sure, what Cromwell did, because standing behind him, there's a great thug of a policeman, and you did not want to see.
Did he have the moustache at that stage?
Absolutely. Look, at this point, he's in, where are we now? He's in, when I first meet him, his early 40s. He did not change at all. Bald, completely bald, very thick set, very powerfully, very short, big moustache.
And a beer-drinking Englishman.
And a bit, well,
in his middle years.
Sort of, by that point. So here we are. What I've done as a young man is to damage and destroy, and at which point Geoffrey, all that kindness, all that Englishness goes, and he becomes a vengeful German. And he writes a shatteringly harsh review of the English court. Attacking not only me, but the much younger historians who'd also written for it. He attacks me on grounds of having got my sources wrong. And I remember he carefully timed it so that it would land for Christmas. I was flying to America, and I remember sitting at Heathrow thinking, what have I? In America, I was fortunately able to check in the wonderful Victorian calendars. And what had happened, Geoffrey's eyesight was beginning to go at this point. I had made one error. He then decided everything else when I claimed the secretarial role of the groom of the stool, when I claimed the financial role of the groom of the stool. He claimed all the rest of them were mistakes too. Do you know what had happened? Geoffrey Elton, the great documentary historian, had not read the whole text, every single claim, apart from one, that I got my facts wrong, was wrong. It was just like going back. You can imagine what I felt. It was just like going back to that first encounter when I was an undergraduate and I'd said to Geoffrey, I think you're wrong. He was now categorically wrong. Very unusually and against the normal practice of the historical journal, where it had actually appeared, the editor, John Morrell, gave me permission to write a reply to the review, in which all the things which I hadn't done when I was given that effective bribe, it was an academic bribe, by Margaret Bowker, I did. I went absolutely straight on. And I demonstrated, as my dissertation really did, but by this point it's absolutely explicit, that his idea of the Tudor Revolution was simply unadulterated, preposterous rubbish that was not supported by the facts. Let's just now shift. Why on earth had it ever been accepted?
Well, that's a very important historiographical.
It's a very. We're going to come on to the bigger historiography in a moment
about the profession and why, in so many areas, it became a very. It
became
popular,
total doctrine. It became total doctrine.
An unexamined belief.
It became an unexamined truth. And again, Oxford hated Geoffrey.
Yeah.
Dominated by medieval history. And years afterwards, I was idly thumbing through a shelf of, rather tatty history books, and I came across the collected letters of K.B. Keith MacFarlane, and edited by Gerald Harris, his great student. Glanced at them. December 1953. There was this astonishing letter describing his response to the Tudor Revolution in government. He describes it as rubbish, vulgar, Americanized, Germanized, vile English, preposterous, barely literate, all that, on and on and on. And then there's this astonishing sentence. But it is going to sweep the board.
Yeah.
In a year's time, every scholarship boy at Dulwich and St. Paul's will have mentioned this and will sweep the board. Now, why did it work? Because, of course, it's the moment. This is the moment when English government bureaucratizes.
Exactly.
It's the moment at which
it's a post-1945
it's post-1945 world. It is perfectly...
And there are more and more publicly funded historians.
And more public. The whole thing, it absolutely works. It's totally perfect. Right. That's demolished Geoffrey. Now may I demolish myself?
Carry on.
And that's what in the last few years, I've decided to do. In other words, my first work tacitly in my dissertation and explicitly in later work, demolished the idea of a Tudor revolution in government. I now think I am wrong. I think there was a Tudor revolution in government, but it was the complete opposite of what Geoffrey said it was. Look at what happens. Let's pull back from everything, as I said.
Are we going to be talking about the reassertion of princely power?
Yes. Think just for one moment what happens. We've been talking about this minutiae of what goes on about the king. Why does the reign of Henry VIII matters? It matters, of course, because of the divorce, of this extraordinary dramatic moment at which England becomes an empire, in which you repudiate the power of the papacy, in which you create an English church, in which you really invent a new rampant form of English nationalism and all the rest of it.
An empire, imperium,
power,
we should point out, means self-enclosed.
It doesn't mean so much.
It doesn't mean having colonies. It means being enclosed.
Not
having authority outside.
Yes, it means autarkic. What it means is you are sufficient. And remember, this idea goes back further in English history. The first time that you actually start using full imperial rank actually is a reflection of the fact that you've acquired another kingdom. It's Henry V. Henry V is the first king, we think, to use the symbol of imperial power. Remember, there's only one emperor, which is the Holy Roman Emperor, going back to Charlemagne and whatever, and it's the mitre or the enclosed crown The English kings of the Middle Ages wear an open crown. It's a bare circlet. What you then do is you put arches on it and surmount them with the famous cross. And it seems to be under Henry under Henry V again, that you alternate the cross pate for England and the fleur-de-lis of France in the bend. And you will see that if you go to the Abbey, you will actually see that crown on his magnificent tomb, the Henry V Chantry tomb, which encloses that great horseshoe of royal tombs around the tomb of Edward the Confessor. So what happens under Henry VIII then is this vast elevation of royal power. As the king declares himself the head of the English church, you sweep away the independence of the English church, which is why you demote so terribly Thomas Becket as a saint and all the rest of it. This vast, vast increase of royal authority. So what it then became clear to me was that the things that Cromwell had done, the enormous increase in the office of secretary, the vast increase in the authority of the council, these were real changes. But they also go along with something else, Howell. They go along with what is often regarded as the long cause of the Reformation. It's to do with increased literacy. It's to do with increased printing. This enormous growth in paper, this enormous growth in terms of the written record. And what Cromwell, master of all of this stuff, does is to create these newish institutions of government about the king, and they vastly, vastly strengthen royal authority, as of course does the Privy Chamber, as in other words, there's no conflict between these things at all. Thomas Cromwell himself is a master of the court. He actually finishes up with the highest court office of all, which he's reinvented, the office of the Lord Great Chamberlainship, along with the Earldom of Essex. So what happens under Cromwell and what happens under Henry is this vast, vast strengthening of the monarchy. Now, interestingly, it's symbolized in one very striking way. We talked about palaces. For the first time, you create a new royal palace in London. You create the huge new palace of Whitehall, which had originally been Cardinal Wolsey's York Place, and it's where it's straight. I mean, to give you an idea of its size, it takes over the whole of the area of the buildings of the Ministry of Defence, right down to the river and right over to Horse Guards. Horse Guards is, in fact, the jousting area of the palace. And all along St. James's Park at that side, you have what I call the Royal Playpen. You've got the tennis court, you've got the cockpit, most of them now within the back of the Treasury, we've seen, and round about Downing Street and so on. So you create a new royal palace in which the king, the Privy Chamber, the Privy Council, the Secretary, all of these things that enormously strengthen the personal authority of the king.
And just next door to where we are now sitting.
Just where we are sitting. But, how had Cromwell and Henry brought about these gigantic changes within the state, the English state? They hadn't done them. They hadn't done what President Trump is doing at the moment. They hadn't done it by royal proclamation. That's executive order. They hadn't done it like that. They'd done it how? They'd done it by Act of Parliament. Because again, one of the things we forget is strong kings love parliaments. Yeah. It's only weak kings who can't handle them. Strong king, Edward I and Edward III are the ones who developed parliament to raise taxes for their wars in France and Wales and Scotland.
And this is the great Stuart weakness.
Yeah, but let's deal with it.
I'm jumping too far ahead.
You are, because we're going to deal with that in a moment. Yeah. So what you do is Cromwell enormously and Henry enormously strengthened the activity of Parliament. Where is Parliament? Parliament is in the old royal palace of Westminster, which had burned out at the beginning, the private bit of which had burned out at the beginning of the reign of Henry VIII and is never lived in again. But what continues in the Great Hall, in the old painted chamber, the old House of Lords chamber, Parliament continues to meet in the old palace. Even more interestingly, all the older institutions of government, which of course still continue, like the Chancery, like the Exchequer, and the new administrative institutions Cromwell creates for finance, like the Court of Augmentations, they all continue meeting in the old palace. So you've now got two royal palaces adjacent to each other.
Isn't there a Court of Wards?
The Court of Wards goes there. They all go into what we call the Palace of Westminster. In other words, what is now we call vulgarly the Houses of Parliament. They're all there. So you've got two royal palaces, one where the king actually lives, and the other, well, all the institutions there act in his name. Look still at the House of Lords. You've got the canopy with the throne. Even in the House of Commons, you've got the royal arms over the Speaker's chair. Obviously, all the judges operate in the King's name under the King's arms and whatever. But they represent, Howell, and this is my blinding insight. They represent two different, not monarchy and republic, but two different views of monarchy. In Whitehall, the palace where the king lives, with Cromwell's things, Henry's things, the Privy Chamber, the Privy Council, the Secretary of State. Who runs it? What runs it? The king or the queen and her will. This is the monarch as the driving will. What we're seeing in America with Trump. What is in Westminster? Government, in other words, government by the king in Whitehall. In Westminster, government under the king. Yeah. There you've got the idea of the king not as the will of government, but the representative figure of legal order and proper procedure. And what I would argue is that what you do then is to create a tremendous tension between those two different views of monarchy, because the broad thrust of English medieval government had been to government under the king. And monarchs like Richard II, especially if they're not militarily successful, who push the government by the king, the assertion of royal will, the great Shakespeare again obviously gets it absolutely right. Yeah. That the petulant arrogance but again the shining, brilliant language and so on of Richard II in that play.
What I think a kind of impotence there as well.
Well, there's power and impotence again, except that Jack Plum didn't write about it. You get this incredible tension between these two different views of monarchy, and what all English history is about from that point onwards is the resolution of that tension. So the Civil War is not, as the absurd version of it thinks, it's not a struggle between monarchy and republicanism. It's a struggle. You only become a republic by accident, and is the very, very last thing you want to do. It's a struggle between two different kinds of monarchy. One government under the king, the other government by the king.
And the failure of monarchy to manage Parliament is really the Stuart disaster.
What happens, I think, is that the Stuarts genuinely believe only in government by the king. The old views of James, again, historians like Conrad Russell, deeply though I was attached to him, simply get it wrong. The Stuarts really did believe in absolutism. And there's another point which is really important to remember. They believe in good government. Once again, you see, we've got a completely wrong model of how English government develops. The parliamentary government is seen as somehow progressive. It's not. It's primitive. Why do we have a parliamentary building which is deliberately, when it burns down in 1834, why do you rebuild it to look medieval? Because Parliament is a medieval institution. In the 17th century, the contemporaries of the Stuarts, the Bourbons in France, are modernising. They're sweeping away these boring representative institutions. They just get in the way. The unique thing about England is that Parliament is able to preserve itself. So we need to see the Civil War in completely the opposite way. The
It's
revolution.
It's a backward-looking move.
Well, the revolutionaries in the Civil War are the king, are the royalists,
Yes.
and
Yes.
the backward-looking, the conservative, is broadly speaking Parliament, which is why so many of the people who had led the resistance to Charles in the 1530s, like Edward Hyde, come back in 1660 with the Restoration as leading royal ministers. Again, I mean, we can now see that the whole Cromwell experiment is simply a failed experiment. It cannot establish legitimacy. Why is it brought back? It's brought back for fundamentally conservative reasons. You do not know what the powers of a Lord Protector are. He's got absolute power. It's a military dictatorship. You bring back the monarchy because everybody knew what the powers of a monarch was, and it was limited under law. So you have the Restoration, the Restoration of 1660, but the problem is it restores simply the same problem, that it's unclear. Is government directly the king's responsibility, or is it to be negotiated with Parliament? Even the Glorious Revolution doesn't settle it. It obviously throws a lot of power into the hands of Parliament, but it's only accepted by William III, whom you bring in because he wants the English Parliament to supply money for war against Louis XIV. In other words, I've even got now how the struggle ends. It is the creation, and we've not understood at all its serious importance, the creation of the office of Prime Minister. It's 1720. It's the emergence of Robert Walpole. And again, we don't really understand the office of Prime Minister properly. The office of Prime Minister is Janus-like. It's a double face. It manages Parliament on behalf of the king using patronage, which is why when people complain about modern prime ministers creating every stupid backbench, loading them with damehoods and knighthoods and peerages and whatever, it's just continuing an ancient tradition. But
its powers as an office, undefined.
Well, indeed. But so what you do is you use the premiership manages Parliament on behalf of the king. It makes Parliament manageable. And on the other hand, it manages the king on behalf of Parliament. And that's to say, it gives a parliamentary majority the ability to control the king and deploy the royal prerogative. So you see, I think we've now got a new model of English history. It's a deeply conservative model, which we...
It sounds to me, not putting words in your mouth there, as if it might be a kind of reformulated Whiggery.
No, because it's the opposite. Whiggery is teleological. I'm arguing that this is fundamentally conservative. It's the precise opposite. No, it's the precise opposite. That whereas to solve these kind of questions, eventually in continental countries, you usually get rid of monarchies. We were able to keep monarchy whilst depriving it of the things that were contentious and keeping the things that were useful, like its dignity, like its sense of history, like its draping, that wonderful phrase of Edmund Burke, draping the brutalities of life with concealing fabric of making it all acceptable. So I think once we again understand what happens in that period of the early 16th century, with that vast turmoil of the Reformation, of printing, of nationalism, and all the rest of it, we can see that again, I don't want to sound too Germanic or too Eltonian. It's almost Hegelian. When you get this struggle.
Bit of teleology going on.
Yes,
there,
you
David.
get yes, sort of. Maybe I'll then withdraw the word Hegelian, but you
I withdraw the word.
You withdraw the word teleological. You get this extraordinary clash of two strengthened things. What happens in the reign of Henry VIII, you simultaneously strengthen the actual power of the king. You also enormously strengthen the notion of the realm as a cooperative institution.
Yes, the estates of the realm.
The estates of the realm, the legal power of Parliament. Henry himself goes on. I stand, my judges tell me that my power stands at its highest in Parliament, which it actually does. the king in Parliament is the final power in England. And I think once you get this sense, the clashes of the 17th century, the tensions of Elizabeth's reign, all become vastly more intelligible. And once again, Harold, it expresses itself in architecture. The first time that you actually build separate governmental buildings is when?
Separate governmental buildings in Whitehall. Oh, much later in the 18th century. Sure.
Yes. What happens is, and the story is wonderful, isn't it? What happens in the reign of William III? The old Palace of Whitehall itself burns out at exactly the moment when if you like, the last gasp of direct royal power is beginning to expire. The building where all this had happened is destroyed, and the monarchy withdraws to St James's, to Hampton Court,
Greenwich,
to Kensington,
Richmond,
no, you never inhabit Greenwich again. Greenwich is never inhabited as a palace after the Revolution. Never in the old Palace of Greenwich is completely destroyed during the Civil War. Charles was experimenting with building a palace, but it never gets very far. And what you do instead, under William and Mary, you develop the Royal Hospital, the Royal Naval Hospital. And indeed, if you want to get a sense of the new orientation of monarchy, a monarchy based on science, based on enlightenment, based on Newton, based on exploration, go into the great painted hall of Greenwich, and Thornhill's magnificent ceiling is all about that. It's how the art, science, merchandise, navigation all lend to the power of a new imperial England, shown by the triumph of William III over Louis XIV.
And isn't that where we have the dual staircase as well? The his and her staircase?
No,
for William and for Mary.
No. All royal palaces have that, because there's a king's side and a queen's side. No, there's nothing.
Isn't that a novel feature of the country?
No, absolutely not. In all royal palaces, there's not only separate staircases, there are completely separate living quarters. You've got a queen's bedchamber, privy chamber, withdrawing chamber, dining chamber, a king's bedchamber, privy chamber, withdrawing chamber.
Not supposed to be made about sovereignty then.
Well, curiously enough, actually, Howell, no, the largest apartments are the Queen's, because the entertainment takes part. The Queen is hostess. Takes place there. But the important thing is, with the destruction of Whitehall by fire, the wonderful phrase of Saint-Simon, the largest and the ugliest palace in the world. It was even bigger than Versailles. This vast, sprawling, dressed up, half-timbered structure goes up with, I'm afraid, Holbein's wonderful portrait of Henry VIII and his wife, Jane Seymour and Henry VIII and Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. That all goes up because it's painted on the wall. What happens from 1720? You start to build the first new buildings of the new governmental departments, quite separate. The Treasury, the Horse Guards, the Privy Council Office, and above all, the gift at the end of the 1720s to Robert Walpole by George II of what? Downing Street. And the front of Downing Street is the modest little thing, but what we forget, the back is a genuine town palace.
Yes.
And what I would say is, the way we need to understand that is, there is a second monarch in England. Just like the Japanese, who've got up to the Meiji Restoration, you've got the emperor, the Mikado, and the shogun, the two separate capitals of the emperor, the mystical emperor in Kyoto, and the shogun in Tokyo. So in England, you've got two monarchs. You've got the king, and you've got the prime minister. And the prime minister exercises the real powers of monarch, as Keir Starmer, who invariably refers to it as my government.
My government.
He is so he's so illiterate. He's so illiterate.
Not the only prime minister
so illiterate.
That solecism,
did Maggie? Surely not.
No, she didn't.
She was far too respectful, wasn't she? Yeah. So how do you? Isn't that
my government sovereignty, reassertion of sovereignty? So with Starmer now, let's kind of
forget all this stuff. Forget all this stuff. Yeah.
I'm quite interested to find out why you think actually Charles I got it so badly wrong with Laud. But where are we now with these big questions of sovereignty and institutional power, do you think, in relation to how Parliament works or does not work?
I think what we've also got to recognise, if I posited a revolution in government that began, as Geoffrey said, in 1530s and doesn't fully play itself out for 2 centuries. I think what we can see is that from the 1720s to really Margaret Thatcher, there's a pretty continuous political pattern. Of course, there are moments of change. The broadening of the franchise in the 19th century, which itself leads directly, once you have the mass franchise after 1867, to the solidification of the party system, to the revision of Erskine May, to the bending of parliamentary procedure, so that it's very, very, very directly controlled by the Prime Minister and the ruling party and all the rest of it. But fundamentally, you can see it as developments within a single theme. I think now we need
strong parties, strong political parties,
strong parties
dispersing patronage.
It was strong, and controlling power. I mean, the reason for that is the new mass franchise. But what is very remarkable, remember, is that England, and it's the only country in continental Europe, in Europe, that's able to do this. It actually is able to modernize its ancient constitution without destroying it. It's very striking, if you go back and look at what is still seen as one of the great classic books on the English constitution, Walter Bagehot.
Yeah.
In Bagehot's constitution, what is the only point of comparison? What is the only foreign government that he discusses in comparison with the English?
In the late 19th century?
In the 1860s. What's the only government?
America.
Exactly. Because it's only in America, the offshoot of 18th century England, that there is representative government. There is no representative government. We forget this. There is no representative government in any of the major powers of continental Europe in 1860. So all these comparisons with Republican and monarchical government are with America. And again, just a quick, because America and the new monarchy of Trump is so much in our minds. Remember, the great point that he makes 2 points. Bagehot makes 2 points about England. First of all, is that a republic has crawled in under the robes of a monarchy in England. Because, of course, this idea of government under the king, managed by the Prime Minister, is effectively Republican. We have all the rights of a Republican citizenship, or we had, without the letter. And in a sense, all America does is to take off the monarchical top dressing and leave something like the late 18th century structure there. But he makes this point about the contrast between Republican and royal government. Royal government is government by a single family, by an individual, and it's got the intelligibility of that. It's got glamour, it's got glitz, it's got mystery. And he says about America, Republican government is boring people doing boring things in boring clothes. Not anymore. America has invented, and particularly with Trump, its own pageantry. Its own family. And I think, in fact, we do need more and more to realize that America is the direct lineal descendant of the great period of English history, which isn't the 19th century; it's the 18th. Anyway, just parking that for one moment.
It's 18th century America, and then there's it's rather boring but powerful Republican America of the second half of the 19th century. But
but it's still boring.
Yes.
It's still boring. Lincoln looks very boring.
Yes.
He's very boring. He's boring like one of Elon Musk's machines. Yes, very effective. But right. And then
poor Mrs. Lincoln, eh?
Poor Mrs. Lincoln. But if we actually come now to the 21st century, this whole development that I've traced from 1720 through the great days of the 18th and the 19th and the early 20th century, comes to a juddering halt in 1997. I think what we need to realise is Blair said he was going to give us a new country. He did give us a new country.
A new country.
A new country with a new
constitution. Which would last for 1,000 years.
And,
do you remember that?
Well, it was 1,000-year Reich, somebody else once said. But it's what he did is terrible. The entire nature of English government before 1997 was the idea of government by representation. It was the idea that you are bound by law because you've taken part in the making of law. In other words, it elevates the principle of representation, the fact I vote, that I choose an MP and my MP sits in Parliament. That's the basis of political obligation. What Blair does under the influence of Europe, under the influence of legal doctrine, under the influence of universal human rights and whatever, he says, no, we don't trust the people. We don't trust democracy. And you begin the process by which you diminish the power of Parliament in every direction you can.
It's also representation of groups and identities.
Yes, but let's focus on what matters in 1997. From 1997 onwards, you distribute power to quangos, to the Bank of England, to English Nature, to the Climate Change Committee. You distribute power to, above all, to the law. What we've really got to understand is how totally undermining the incorporation of the European Declaration of Human Rights is. And again, it's the problem. Human rights sound lovely, don't they? All sweet and cuddly,
like international law.
And international law
that
too.
Great chimera.
That other great chimera. But just let's look at the problem of human rights. If there are European, or still worse, universal human rights, it means they don't derive their authority from us. They don't derive the authority from Britain or from the people, the British electorate. They sit above it. Yeah. And what's even worse, of course, when all of this is written up by lawyers, by the senior law lord at the time, by Tom Bingham, he explicitly describes human rights law as anti-democratic.
And a good thing because of it.
Because it's anti-democratic. And it is also deliberately prejudiced to minorities. It's designed to protect the minority against the majority. So when people say it's two-tier, I'm afraid the two-tier is actually written into our legal system, as is the fragility of our frontier. Because, of course, if human rights assume that there's a common human being, that there is no history, that there are no nations. It is stuff of the most astonishing radicalism. Similarly, if you believe in international law in the literal sense of Bingham or Keir Starmer or the current Attorney General.
It's a kind of divine right, really.
Well, it is divine right of law. I'm saying again, it's this extraordinary notion that's bandied around with the American Revolution, though the Americans are too sensible to adopt it, that you want a government of laws, not of men. Well, that means a government of lawyers, because who else can possibly administer law? And of course, international law means you have no national interest. I mean, but hence you give away the Chagos Islands. Hence, you decide you cannot sentence the Southport mass murderer to a full life term, because international, some obscure notion of the United Nations says that no child under the age of 18 should possibly receive such a sentence. Complete absurdities. And still worse, finally, is the Equality Act. I don't know whether you realise this. The Equality Act is our only act of Parliament to incorporate an equation.
I had not grasped that.
The equation is, I'm afraid, even more extraordinarily, it incorporates the Marxist labour theory of value. On which grounds you've bankrupted Birmingham.
Yes.
You are now bankrupting every other local authority, and you will bankrupt next in our entire structure of retail with this false equivalence, the idea that a judge operating this formula can determine a notional fair wage between one job done by a woman and another completely different job done by a man. How can you do that? It's juju. It's preposterous. So you can see there's been the most extraordinary, and again, the creation of the Supreme Court, which acts, again, with Bingham very much responsible for it, which acts as the...
Very much a creature of the Labour government.
That's right.
Charlie Faulkner.
And all the rest of them.
Rushed through.
And the whole thing... Now, you see, you put your finger on something really remarkable. All this was done without serious thought or proper explanation. Again, devolution. But to just give you an idea of how extraordinarily off the cuff it was. This we've heard perpetually, because Starmer and Hermer incorporate this, the rule of law.
Yeah.
Why didn't we hear very much about the rule of law before? Do you know why? Because it's invented in November 2006 in a lecture at Cambridge, and it's wonderful, sort of having this kind of knockabout. It's Charlie Faulkner. What happens was they decide, because it challenges the doctrine of separation of powers, and the doctrine of separation of powers is a good thing. Of course, it's founded on the stupidity of Montesquieu, all bad ideas of French, and it's complete misunderstanding.
Who came to England and misunderstood what was going on.
Misunderstood completely, barely spoke a word of English, and spent all his time with a mad group of people round Viscount Bolingbroke. It's no wonder he got the thing as completely and as absurdly wrong as it did. But on these, and how can you have a separation of powers when the legislative is controlled by the executive, which is what we have here? I mean, it's a ludicrous notion. Anyway, and by the way, it was all,
but with a very special role for judges.
Yes, and it was designed, remember, also simply to dethrone Derry Irving, the Lord Chancellor, who had been Blair's pupil master, and had got above himself and was parading himself around like Cardinal Wolsey, even refurbishing his lodgings with appropriate magnificence. Anyway, Faulkner thinks...
Well, the pupil often does turn against the master.
Indeed. Faulkner actually determined to demolish the office of Lord Chancellor. It was going to be abolished, and you would have a nice progressive European thing called a Minister of Justice. I always find
so sinister.
I find tingling things go up and down the spine, and indeed we've seen.
I mean, the adjective Orwellian is overused, but the Ministry of Justice really
really again, and the fact that words mean the opposite. The Ministry of Injustice and Persecution. Anyway, he can't abolish it because, of course, he was too stupid to realise it actually appears in about 2,000 statutes. So you'd have had really to have rewritten statute law. So they preserve it, but as an adjunct, the office of Lord Chancellor, as an adjunct to that of Secretary of State for Justice. And they also, as part of this innovating nonsense, they come up with a new oath. And the first item of the oath is that the new Lord Chancellor will swear to uphold the rule of law. At which point everybody thinks, God, we don't know what the rule of law
actually is.
So by complete coincidence, wonderful story. By complete coincidence, Bingham happened to be delivering the Williams lectures at Cambridge. So he invents the rule of law. He discovers it has 8 points, as I've said. Yes. Why not? Why not 10? It gives it an additional authority, the commandments. 7 was good. Seven was good enough for God, to create the world in. But it's got 8 points. 5 of them are fine, and 3 of them are mad. One of them is the human rights law with the anti-democratic and bias to the minorities. The second is the full incorporation of international law. And the third is truly astonishing. It's the deduction from the notion of equality before the law, which indeed had always been one of the outstanding principles of English law. I mean, whereas in continental law, you had a legal system for a nobleman, a churchman, and a peasant. England, the only noble privilege in England was if you murdered, you were hanged with a silken rope rather than a hemp one. That was the only actual legal privilege of nobility.
Having been tried by your peers.
Having been tried by you, indeed. But then everybody was tried by their peers.
Yeah.
It just happened to be a rather small bunch of peers, most of whom you knew and were your second cousins. And so, with any luck, they would let you off. But they did, by no means did they always do that. But from that notion of equality before the law, do you know what Bingham deduces? There's no difference between a native and a foreigner. Yeah. And you can see the whole of this catastrophe. In other words, everything that's gone wrong in Southport, everything that's gone wrong with the groomings gangs, you can see the whole, and again, as part of this gross overinflation of law and quangos, you can see why all the bits of the British state fight each other, why it's impossible to do anything, why you have back tunnels.
And the devolutionary settlements
is another catastrophe. Because, and again, you see, we lost. We haven't obviously had time to talk about the fact that
we've lost a sense of what representation means.
We've lost that completely. And again, the creation of professional MPs, it's a great problem with paying them, the notion that it's a job.
Yes.
The fact that we constantly shift,
running your own company, but on the public purse.
On the public purse. Again, the disaster of constantly shifting the boundaries of parliamentary constituencies in the name of evening up the population. People have no idea.
That's an arithmetical.
Yes, but it's
that cuts across real geographical.
That's right.
And cultural sense.
And do you know what? It's exactly what Edmund Burke accuses the French of doing at the time of the Revolution, when they replace the ancient boundaries of France, with the départements, which were deliberately designed to overthrow the traditional frontiers of France. And again, he actually uses the word you've done. He talks about arithmetical equality rather than respecting that flow of the countryside of history, of tradition.
So we no longer have political parties in the traditional British sense that do the job of representation.
I think that's absolutely right.
And that is the really revolution, often overused, but it is a revolutionary element in our constitution.
I agree, but I think it goes on. I mean, the whole point about the parliamentary constitution was that the law was subordinate to Parliament. We're now in a position where it's entirely the other way around. And we now have a man who rules Parliament who is a lawyer. And the Starmer's astonishing lack of sympathy. And remember, there's something very important. The Prime Minister really matters. I use that phrase. He, or indeed she, is effectively a monarch.
Yes.
We expect them to embody certain monarchical capacity. They are a representative figure. They must, of course, they're creations of party, but if they're to be any good at their job, they've got to arise and go above party. This is somebody beneath party. This is somebody with no political skill whatever, who thinks that the solution to everything is a legal phrase or a legal formula. It's terrible.
Wooden and terrible, and the origins of a great conflagration that may be discerned in front of us. David, marvellous to be in your company here today, the Erasmus Forum. Few people could do a disquisition as learned and eloquent, jumping over the centuries. I still think we haven't done justice to the poor old early Stuarts and why they got it all so very badly wrong.
That could be another one.
But I think you can come back next time for that. Thank you, David Starkey, very much indeed.
A great pleasure.